Welcome all, Dax here. I recently got my hands on a PS5 and I haven't put it down since. Well, more specifically the Dualsense controller. The PS5 is pretty big and awkward. So far I've been very impressed with it, easily being my favorite PlayStation controller to date. It's interesting to see how similar yet different it is to the DualShock 4. I also got an Xbox Series S this last year and have really enjoyed that controller as well. Considering that the Series S has the same controller as the X, I wanted to make this video to compare and contrast the differences between these two next-gen consoles with some of my preferences thrown in. Spoiler alert, these are both great controllers, but they do have their own strengths and weaknesses that I wanted to talk about. And this might be something good to consider also if you're cross-shopping for PC. But without further ado, let's begin with what these two share in common. The basic formula established by Nintendo in the 1980s is still followed today with direction inputs, face buttons, triggers, and effectively a start and select button. These are all commonalities that apply to just about all modern controllers today, even the Switch. Both controllers have changed throughout the years, but the Dualsense has been the more radical redesign this generation. Xbox has taken if it ain't broke, then don't fix it approach, with the main differences coming in the revision of the D-pad, some extra grip, and the addition of a share button. Funny enough, PlayStation hasn't actually added any new buttons unlike Xbox, but has reshaped and refined the controller with a different feel and new features, which we will get into here in just a sec. Real quick, let's briefly talk about the visuals. Sony has gone for a primarily white design with black subsections to match the look of their new bold console. As of this recording, there are 5 other color options if white isn't doing it for you. In addition to the white controller included in the box, I also picked up a cosmic black offering to keep with my black and white next-gen setup. I ended up doing the same for my Xbox, getting one of each to match. I personally really like both controllers in both colors, but in all honesty I am somewhat tempted to just customize my own color combo at Microsoft's Design Lab. I haven't given in yet, but if you want to customize almost every aspect of your controller, including things like build materials in just about any assortment you can imagine, that's the place to go. Going back to the stock options, I've always been a fan of the bold colored letters on the Xbox face buttons, but I'm also a bit of a sucker for the changing light bar on the DualSense, even though neither affect gameplay in any way. Overall, looks are super subjective, so I will leave it to you the viewer to come to your own conclusions here. The DualSense comes with a couple extra features as I mentioned over the Xbox, with each having varying levels of usefulness. The big two advertised are adaptive triggers and haptic feedback. The feedback is basically a really sophisticated rumble that is nuanced enough to simulate the feeling of something as specific as rain droplets. The other big feature unique to the DualSense is the adaptive triggers, which give players varying levels of resistance depending on gameplay. The best and most common implementation of this feature is seen with games that utilize bow and arrows or guns. Different guns may take varying levels of effort to pull the trigger, just like in real life. So far I've liked most of the ways that I've seen games implement this feature. There are a couple examples that go a little too overboard for me, like Dirt 5, which is still a solid game though. Neither of these features fundamentally change the user experience that much, but they do succeed in adding an additional layer of immersion to the user. In my opinion, I think Xbox has fallen somewhat short here, but still offers a great package that is unaffected by these shortcomings in many situations. When it comes to comparing games that don't utilize the adaptive triggers, like anything within the PS4's library, then I do prefer the feeling of Xbox's trigger for having a very satisfying impact, similar to that of pressing a piano key. Also a feature not found with the Xbox and a carryover from last generation, the DualSense has a touchpad that also doubles as a clickable button. While hardly ever used to much effect, when it is used it can be a useful addition and input method. While not a major game changer, I do like the use of the touchpad in games like Ghost of Tsushima, where several commands were mapped to different directions, which could have really benefited a game like Halo Infinite, where toggling through special abilities and grenades was less than optimal during combat. Similar to the touchpad, the PlayStation controller also carries over a speaker from last generation, which again is cool in concept but hardly ever utilized to any major effect. It is better this time around when mixed in with the haptics, but is otherwise left mostly untouched. Both controllers include an audio jack for headphones, with Xbox also including an expansion port for certain high-end headsets. PlayStation has a mic built into the controller, which is really convenient if you don't have a dedicated headset, but it's definitely not the best option to rely on with suboptimal audio quality. PlayStation gives you convenience with middle-of-the-road results, while Xbox gives you the option for a top-notch solution, but leaves it up to you to find and buy on your own. I wonder how many Xbox owners even know what the expansion port is for. My guess is not too many. This approach also continues with each company's solution to batteries. Ever since the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 generation, Microsoft has opted to use AA batteries, while Sony has gone with an internal lithium-ion solution. Both methods come with their pros and cons. The Dualsense will on average last you between 4 to 7 hours, depending on what game you're playing, while the standard AA's included with Xbox will average around 40. The cable included with the PlayStation 5 is far too short to use during gameplay, being only really useful for outside of game charging, which is mostly doable if you remember to plug it in after every session. Clearly the AA method interferes with your gaming time a lot less often over the Dualsense. However, when it does die, you better hope you have some AA's on hand. I can't tell you how many times when I was younger either me or a friend was put into a scenario where a battery-powered controller, usually an Xbox One, died on us with not a single set of AA's around. I think this PTSD has led me to favor the Sony approach more, but there are a few options worth mentioning. An easy solution I wish I had when I was younger is rechargeable AA's. 4 will set you up nicely to avoid most frustrating scenarios unless you forget to charge your extras as well, but this still saves you a last-minute trip to the store. You can also buy an official battery pack from Microsoft that is able to charge via USB-C, which is an even better method. For the Dualsense, there's always the option to just buy a longer cable, but I do caution all of you who play this way. I always think back to this time when one of my friends tripped over the charging cable, sending their PS5 tumbling into the ground with permanent internal damage. To make matters worse, the Dualsense's internal battery is only going to get worse as it gets older, with no option of replacing it. The best solution I found for the Dualsense is to buy a charging station with an additional controller on standby. I also ended up utilizing the same solution for my Xbox controllers, which has worked out great so far. It's not bad to go for the AA approach, but I think Microsoft should have included a battery pack with every console if they were going to go that route. Similar complaints can be aimed at PlayStation for not including a charging station of some sort, because a dangling cable is not very next gen now, is it? Since I'm already complaining, I'm going to throw in some of my personal pet peeves for each controller. First is the manufacturer information on the back of the Dualsense. It just looks super ugly and out of place in comparison to the design language found on the rest of the controller, and is inescapable no matter what color you choose. When it comes to the Xbox controller, I can't stand the gaps in plastic. I'm not sure whose idea this was, but it looks kinda cheap, and it becomes a really gross collection of dead skin and gunk, which looks absolutely great in white. These complaints may not bother you, but I do feel like it's gonna bother somebody, so I think they're worth mentioning. Going back to button layouts, PlayStation has remained symmetrical with their joystick design, while the Xbox controller is asymmetrical. I personally don't prefer one location over another when it comes to my left joystick, with both being easily accessible for me. From the people I've talked to, most seem to prefer the asymmetrical design of Xbox. I've never had any issues with either layout, and I don't really understand the logic behind it considering you use the right joystick fine. But if you do have a preference, then I'm sure you're not going to change your preference now. The actual joysticks themselves are a little different, with Xbox favoring a concave top with more aggressive gripping around the edges. Now, one of the main points I have heard from players who prefer Xbox controllers over PlayStation is comfort. The ergonomics of this controller is pretty spot on, and traditionally I would agree with the comfort argument, With this generation, Sony's really stepped up the game, making it a little less straightforward of an answer for me. The Dualsense is easily the most comfortable PlayStation controller to date, with smoother curves and a grip that naturally fits in the hands. One thing worth mentioning, however, is how these two compare in size. The base of each controller is very similar. However, the top of the Dualsense is far less concaved compared to the Xbox controller, leading to farther reaches, which is potentially a problem for smaller hands. I have relatively medium-ish sized hands and haven't had any issues, but I could definitely see this being somewhat uncomfortable for those of you with smaller hands. Let's move on to D-pads. This is another area where the two companies have taken quite different approaches. The Xbox's D-pad is one large piece of plastic with a lowered center point to reset your thumb on. PlayStation has gone for a touched up version of their classic D-pad, but with some glossy plastic found on the other face buttons. The DualSense gives a more decisive feel of what direction you're pressing, but is kind of slippery with the new coating. On the flip side, the Xbox's valley shape is not ideal for true platformers due to its lack of directional delineation, but is great for accessing inventory. There was an immediate difference I also noticed when it came to the D-pads that actually is applicable to the rest of the controllers, and that proposes the question of whether to click or not to click. As a whole, the Xbox controller is extremely clicky, which from a feedback point of view can be quite pleasing. I'd say it's a little too clicky for my liking. And what I mean by this is just how noisy it can be when playing just about any genre of game. The DualSense isn't silent by any means, but is a lot less harsh on the ears as a player or an observer. The noise problem might not bother most gamers, but I immediately noticed it, kind of reminding me of the GameCube controller. Keep in mind, my goal isn't to bash on these controllers, but is to bring up the macro and micro differences in philosophy and execution. For me, these are easily some of my favorite controllers ever made, which is super cool considering they just came with the consoles. To recap, PlayStation excels at giving players a new feeling and an immersive experience with things such as haptic feedback and the new form factor. Xbox still offers one of the best feeling controllers to date, with small enhancements that inch closer to the impression of perfection in the hands. I personally really like the look of the Xbox controller as well as the extra grip and satisfying triggers. On the PlayStation side of things, I do prefer the button presses and am a sucker for the haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers, giving the controller a real next-gen feeling. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. I wanted to compare and contrast these two without making it about who's quote-unquote better. If you did enjoy my video, please leave me a like and let me know your thoughts down below. As always, I want to thank you all for watching, and until next time, see ya!